this second seminar of the CRSCEES series, Access All Areas. I'm Emily Feiner, Senior Lecturer in Russian at the University of St Andrews, and this is the second panel discussion this semester. And today we're going to present our research projects with a view to asking how multilingual and translanguaging practices can shape a new model for area studies, where the area in question is Russia, Soviet, Central and Eastern Europe. I'm going to say a few words as an introduction and then introduce today's panel. And I also want to reveal our Padlet. I will do that in a minute, where we've collected the links to our projects and publications. It looks like another meeting has just started. Okay, I'm just going to ignore that and keep going. I'm great. I think it's that the recording has started. Fantastic. Okay, so I will, after I finish speaking, post a link to the Padlet in the chat, where I believe you can add comments to what's posted there. And you're also welcome to type questions for the panel to discuss in the Teams chat at any point, and I'll pick those up at the end. So I want to start from the premise that more people in the world are multilingual than monolingual, and that translanguaging is a linguistic reality in the 21st century. Multilingualism refers to the use of more than one language, whereas translanguaging refers to, in Leeway's description, practices that transcend the boundaries between named languages, language varieties, and language and other semiotic systems. So translanguaging asks us to question what a language is, and to think beyond terms that assume that languages are associated with nations, and to reassess adjectives applied to languages such as foreign, native, indigenous, minority, or even Russian. In the context of education, translanguaging could be understood in Suresh Kanagaraja's explanation, the ability for multilingual speakers to shuttle between languages, treating the diverse languages that form their repertoire as an integrated system. So multilingualism and translanguaging are not only a challenge to area studies, they're a challenge to existing university structures. And this is particularly relevant, I think, at St Andrews, which is a university with a thriving Russian department, but with a commitment to decentering Russia, and sometimes to decentering the so-called standard Russian that we teach to undergraduates. So CRSCEES can be a driver to access areas out with the School of Modern Languages at St Andrews, something that fosters interdisciplinarity and collaborations with scholars who live and work in multiple languages. But the panel members today also have something important in common, which is that our research shares a commitment to an area not always considered by area studies, and that's the area in which we live and work. So whenever the people on today's panel teach, research, Google, read and speak, they're inhabiting both places in Central, Eastern Europe, Russia, and also in Scotland simultaneously. So in our discussion to prepare for this panel, it became clear that we all share a curiosity about the potential for a multilingual area studies to act as an antidote to the United Kingdom's inhospitable environment to languages other than English. So I'm going to introduce today's panel, and then we will start with the first intervention. So we have Elwira Grossman, who is lecturer in Polish and comparative literature at the University of Glasgow. We have Mirna Solic, who is lecturer in Czech at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures, also at the University of Glasgow. Polina Kliuchnikova is associate lecturer in Russian language and culture here at St Andrews. And Jamie Rann is lecturer in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Glasgow. So I think that we'll start with Elwira and Mirna. You're welcome to share your screen and just go ahead. I'm going to turn off my microphone.
Elwira, would you like to introduce yourself, and then I will continue?
No, I mean, I think what Emily has said is just absolutely fine. So yes, thank you very much. I mean, what I would really just like to add to this is that I was involved in a collaborative effort to prepare some kind of language packages for local schools, and this was based on some of the research I have done in relation to translinguality and also to translanguaging, and translingual memoirs, translingual writing. But for today's purposes, Mirna and I have prepared a brief presentation together, and Mirna has kindly agreed to speak on our behalf. So she will say a few words about how our research informs these larger paradigm of area studies, and also how it still is affecting our teaching methods as well. So just a few words about some of the courses we teach and the research initiatives we have jointly prepared. So thank you, Mirna, please.
Thank you very much, Elwira, for introduction. Thank you, Emily, for inviting us. I actually have a little complaint to do to the panel organizers, because the title is How to Create a New Model for Area Studies when the area is Russian, Soviet, Central and East European. And I'm just asking you, what about the Balkans? What about Southeast Europe? That part seems to be missing all the time from, whenever we talk about, the area of Central and Eastern Europe. And this is just me coming not only from the field of Czech studies, but also from the field of Southeast, or the so-called former Yugoslavia. So I would say the Balkan languages and the literatures, so basically working across the field. As Elwira said, today we'll be talking about our research-led teaching. And I'm going to share with you a small presentation. You can find some examples of our work on Padlet, and I'll be very happy to, discuss this with you. We'll be very happy to discuss this with you afterwards. Our project today is related to migration, because next year we are starting Royal Society of Edinburgh funded research on how to teach migrations in school systems in Scotland and abroad. So this is something that would interest you, let me know, and we'll send you invitations for our workshops. Now, I hope you can all see, the slides. If you can't, or if you can't hear me, just please unmute yourself and, let me know, and we will see if we have any technical difficulty. So basically, I will try to keep it very short. There are 2 points of departure for us when we talk about, how to create the new model for the field of for the area studies, and they have to do with, what we do and who we are. So our position is that we work in the field of lesser taught languages. I personally am doing Czech, Slovak, Croatian, Serbian, and the so-called Bosnian language and associated literatures and cultures, and Vila does Polish as well. And these are kind of interesting simply because you always have to know how to attract people to do them, and we do it in a way that we try to make them aware of the culture, and then okay, I will explain about the Balkans later. So we do it via the culture to make people really interested, inspired, and then simply, go and immerse themselves in language learning. This has proven very, I would say, fruitful, especially in the field of Balkan studies. And we have, I would say, a number of even PhD applications for people who would like to do the Balkan studies with us. And also, I think we should never disregard our own position of researchers. We move across cultures, across languages, we live in different countries, we work with different people and so on. And I think it is always about our identities, that who we are, this is what we do. So this can't be, divided, and we can't really think about them separately. We think that, first we have to deal with labels and templates. For instance, one of the label which bothers me for a long time in Western academia, also in Central Europe as well, is the so-called Slavic and or Slavonic studies, because when we talk about Slavic Slavonic studies, then I always wonder, what about non-Slavic cultures? And for instance, what about Jews? What about Balkan Muslims, Roma people, and so on? For instance, I know that many departments in the US which deal with the Balkan studies would be automatically grouped within Middle Eastern or even Near Eastern departments, which is kind of, I think, problematic because, again, then the Slavic component is dismissed. So it is always that we are being somewhere in between. And then recently, I just heard about the shift resembling that the English literature departments are now moving to be Anglophone literatures. And I was wondering if there is anything similar in our field. I'm not saying that, the Anglophone and the Slavic are the same, but then still maybe, we should reassess according to those lines. Also, what we do very much has to do with the shift from the linguistic to non-verbal means of communication and identity, simply because we no longer communicate only through language, we communicate through images, through media, and through non-verbal means of communication. And I think these also have to be considered when we speak about languages. And now I'm talking about films, I'm talking about photography, I'm talking about new media and all other material which we use to communicate and disseminate information as well. One big point also is about diaspora. Where do they belong in our field? And Elwira can, tell you something about it when it comes to Polish language teaching. Because diaspora tells us that the studies of one region are not only about geopolitical region, but also about imaginative geographies, and as Emily said, being in Scotland while being somewhere else at the same time. And in our teaching and research, we are always trying to see if there are global topics, the so-called overarching themes, which we can apply to the local context, or if there is anything from the local context that we can take and make it global. And I will show you some examples, and I will tell you why this matters. For instance, example one, there is a course that we run which has to do with representations of city space in literature and on film. This is my favorite course, I have to say. So what we do, we, for instance, try to access different city spaces, such as Second World War, so Holocaust in Prague, or the siege of Sarajevo. For instance, you see one example of that with what students know, and that is perhaps at this moment Glasgow under lockdown. So we always ask them to reflect on their own experiences of the crisis, to reflect on their own experiences of space, of languages they know that are used within that space, of history, of culture, of their own identities, and then apply them elsewhere. So this is how we create for them. Again, I have to refer to Emily because I really like that statement about being in Scotland by being elsewhere. And then when they can apply their own experiences and their own knowledge to a culture which maybe they know or not, then I think this is what triggers, this wish to expand the knowledge, to become more immersed, and to go on and to learn the language as well. So this is basically, I think, about embracing transcultural understanding across space, times, and languages, just by sharing experiences and trying to find similarities in experiences, because languages for us are not only about disseminating information or knowledge or communication, but they're also about sharing emotions, sharing feelings, sharing identities. And maybe also this is the way how then we move from this, the point of view of thinking about languages in terms of belonging to a nation, because when other people use these languages, they will also learn how to communicate and share emotions through adopted languages as well. And another example which I will show you, and I apologize if I'm really going too quick, but I would rather discuss things with you than just talk. For instance, one such, I would say, field or one such area where this could be applied are migration studies and the theme of migration. Because when you look at the region of, I would say, Central and East Europe and the Balkans, they are just about people migrating. And I'm not saying that migrations are always bad, that people are just go somewhere as refugees or because they are, as we say, humanly displaced. But migration is also about, travels, about tourism, about going to work, about going to study, and also about meeting people on the go, and also communicating with people, and also about, exchanging feelings and emotions, and also about identity. So when we, for instance, when they talk about migrations in the area, then again, we take examples of different people meeting. For instance, you have the example of Croatian film, The Melon Route, where a Bosnian war survivor helps a Chinese girl to survive and cross the river Sava on her way to Germany and develop some sort of relationship without even speaking the language. Or for instance, in Romanian Morgan, when you have the same situation of a Romanian peasant who only dreams about going to the Black Sea for little sea holidays where he can fish. And this is what he becomes aware of when he meets a Kurdish migrant who he then hosts and again helps him to get away to Germany, even though they don't speak each other's language. Or the same happens in a Polish or a Glasgow-based film, Vigilia, about a Polish maid who then makes a big change in life of the Scottish people while she deals with her own trauma of the loss of family and perhaps also being abroad. And I think this is, when you use different characters and when you locate them in different spaces, this is then how, through this, we call them the points of meeting points or communication points. This is, how you make people aware of the importance of languages, of communications, but also of non-verbal means of communicating. So what I'm trying to say is that whatever that we do, we always take into considerations who the students are, and also who the people are who are listening to us, and how we can help them to use their own experiences in accessing the region, which is in a way different or similar, but which is definitely worth exploring. And there are similarities just across space and time. So I'm just going to end this presentation, and I'm very sorry if I was too quick and I do not have the last slide. But basically, looking at the region of the Central and East Europe from the point of contacts between the global and the local, and focusing on transnational, translingual, and transcultural phenomena may reveal a different understanding of the region beyond purely linguistic boundaries. Because if languages only, I don't know how much we will learn about culture, and I'm really not sure that we will, make people understand the region if they don't have this non-verbal element as well included and understood. But the question is how we accommodate this perspective and expand the existing paradigm to make it more compatible with ever-changing world. Thank you very much, and I really apologize if this was a bit confusing for you, and I'm open to any questions, and Elwira as well. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Mirna. Yes.
Now, how do I stop sharing?
Thank you. I think.
Okay.
Yep. Is that
okay? Did it stop sharing? No. Dismiss.
I think I just turned it off.
Cool.
That's
Thank
okay. Thank you so much, Mirna. Elwira, do you want to add anything now, or should we move on to the next paper and have questions at the end?
I would prefer to move on because then I might just get into a discussion, and that's a point. So thank you very much, Mirna. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move on to Polina Kliuchnikova, who is right there. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much to Emily and to everyone who put so much effort into organizing this seminar. I'm really privileged to be part of it. In a manner of a very short introduction, I just wanted to tell you that one of them, the most recent project that I was involved in, it was called Language Borders. You could read a little bit more about it in the link that is provided in the Padlet if you feel interested. But just in a nutshell, it was focusing on the social linguistic experience of migrants coming to Russia from other post-Soviet countries. So I was interested in exploring the discourses and also practices behind those discourses around the quite popular mainstream concept of this language integration of the migrants, but also it would be a concept that is quite ambivalent and open to different interpretations by people who, by agents who are interested in shaping the process. So I was looking at the intersection of three perspectives there. There was obviously this like top-down governmental effort, and in this regard, I was focusing on the language certification as a part of the process of migrants getting the work permit or the permit to study or stay in the country. Then I was focusing on the migrants themselves and how they discovered their language competence, their language, the set of linguistic skills that they have as a focal point of their migrant experience in Russia. And then I was also looking at the quite a diverse set of local urban projects that were aimed at language support and engaging with migrants and how the local communities would interact with migrants and what their interpretation of language would be. And for our seminar today, I just prepared actually one image, my favorite image from my fieldwork, which not just is very dear to me, but it also, for me, it kind of provides an interesting maybe intersection of issues connected to the across the post-Soviet space and at the same time the context of mobility. But if you don't mind, I would like to introduce it with a bit of a quote from a book by Jan Blommaert, who was arguing towards the social linguistics of linguistic resources rather than languages. And he would say that a social linguistics of resources, and I quote here, and mobility as the dislocation of language and language events from the fixed position in time and space is a central theoretical concern in this social linguistic of linguistic resources. And he continues, truncated linguistic repertoires grounded in people's biographies become part of the ways migrants build their life trajectories in social, cultural, personal, and professional domains. So getting back to migrants' interpretation of this beautiful quote from Blommaert, if I can, I'll just share the screen. Let me see. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the example that I was talking about. So this illustration is a photo from a cover of a diary / a journal / a phone book, an account book, and a notebook to practice Russian of a migrant who came to work in Vladivostok from Tajikistan, and due to some problems with passing this language test that he had to do to get a work permit, he was made to stay in the country like semi-legally for quite a while. And this notebook, which he called in quite non-standard Russian in a way, I'm going to just translate briefly for those who don't read Russian. So it says notes on the journey to, or we could say in, Vladivostok from 23rd of June till going back home in 2017 by and his name. And it is basically his life writing practice where he describes what is happening to him He makes some plans about his future. He remembers his past. He writes like drafts of letters to his family back in Tajikistan. And all of it is in this tangle of Tajik, Russian. Sometimes he uses some Arabic inscriptions if he knows. So he was very kind to read the whole diary to me, and he translated some of the examples where I asked him. So I was fascinated how the mixture of these linguistic resources becomes the only possible means to kind of express his transnational experience of, and this is something that both Emily and Mirna have just mentioned as well. So this experience of being here, not quite being here, and being there, communicating to his homeland in all possible ways. So to me, this image kind of illustrates how the language competence of large groups of people escapes the standardized framework of language test or any other formalized procedure of assessment. And with this particular person, it was indeed one of the reasons why he had to move into this semi-legal status of staying in Russia. Nevertheless, he was more capable of, more than capable, I would say, of describing his experience, talking to me about his experience. He used Russian as his only language to communicate with his customers in that community where he stayed. He also used Russian quite, I would say, not just proactively, but creatively in his notes, in the notebook, which he showed to me. So my consideration about this growing multilingualism within the post-Soviet space is about, again, this growing, spreading mismatch between the institutionalized linguistic expectations towards migrants who, for example, come to work or study in Russia, and the variety, the complexity, the intersection of linguistic resources that real people have. And in this sense, the effort of creating a particular language profile, which every entrant should fit into, should demonstrate by sitting the test, by getting the language certificate, is it is on the one hand pragmatically futile, but also in a way obsolete, trying to kind of capture the shifting linguistic repertoires with something as straightforward and direct as a language test. My second observation based on this example kind of shifts its main perspective towards the language user themselves. And again, I'm quite fascinated by this constant merging of different linguistic resources at hand and their active and creative use to communicate the experience of mobility across spaces. And I particularly like this example because on the one hand, it kind of manifests the idea of a journey, something that I used as a title for my talk today. But that wouldn't be the first comparison which a life of a labor migrant somewhere in the outskirts of a large Russian urban space would prompt, probably. But it has a very important connotation for me of this understanding of borders, crossing borders, but also going through different cultural spaces. Also kind of inviting me, us to look at the idea of language borders, or languages being embodied within the nation states as a rather just a concept of a top-down governmental effort rather than the fabrics of everyday communication. It also provides a very interesting take for me on the temporality of migrant experiences. Here, it has this is from June to going home. But I guess I'll just leave it here like that now. I'm more than happy to discuss it in questions afterwards. And the first final observation that I wanted to was connected to the previous two. Comes from this example. more specifically, maybe from the way it quite playfully and ironically interacts with this pre-printed grid of tetrads, like the school notebook, and fills in the blanks with the information relevant to the writer himself, but still in some way follows the format, making this bit of a, like again, an ironic comment. And this example got me thinking about the relevance of educational effort, which is available to people who start being on the move and to the new experience they find in migration. And despite almost 3 decades after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, educational systems in some of the post-Soviet countries still bear a lot of legacy from the Soviet era educational discourse, obviously less so over the years, but it's still visibly present, especially in quite like performative ways of almost like symbolical dedication. And obviously, not surprisingly, these are usually the forms which are most supported by Russia's government projects seeking to kind of maintain or reestablish its cultural significance within this post-Soviet space. And just to maybe to contrast with the previous example, I've got another photo here coming from my field work. This is actually a special event on the 6th of June, which is the birthday of Alexander Pushkin. And this event was held at the Russian Center of Tajik National University in 2018, where some high school students were invited to the university to publicly recite Pushkin's poems in front of the Russian department faculty. I was very lucky to be present at the event, but it also, again, made me wonder about the skills and competences acquired from the students at the event, and the linguistic or more like social linguistic realities which they would face coming to Russia to study, work, live afterwards. And in the sense, I guess, we can also talk about some translation effort, which is required not only between or among different languages, so different linguistic resources, but also within the variance registers or skills attributed to just one language. And Russian is the example that I have for this example. I think I'm gonna stop here. Thank you so much. And I would be glad to answer the questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Polina. That's some amazing examples there. I will move straight on to Jamie Rann at this point.
Thanks, Emily.
I apologize. Can I just say Elwira and me will have to leave in 15 minutes because we teach a class at 11. So if
yes,
anybody...
I remember that. Don't worry.
Okay. If anybody has a question, please put them in chat. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. And I'll try to leave some time so that we can talk to Elwira and Mirna before they have to go. Thanks, Emily, for the introduction, and also to the organisers for putting this together, and also the other speakers who've given me a lot to think about, and maybe if I can try and respond to as I talk, not about any research that I've actually done per se, but research that I would perhaps like to do, or what I think is a potentially fertile area for doing some more research. I want to start by building on, I was really interested in what Mirna said about language and about the non-lingual and the kind of the affect and having you know, an emotional connection with things. And I'm interested in, as someone who's interested in poetry in other languages and between other languages, how that can happen in language, and kind of building on what Polina was saying about not challenging this idea of language as something completely perfect that everyone can understand. And I want to start by playing a clip from an event that was organized by Tom Hubbard, who I think is here on the call. Thanks very much, Tom. And I'm just going to play Sheena Blackwell, in fact, is her name, reading a bit of her oversetting of Chekhov's The Rothschild's Fiddle. Let me just check that you can all hear that. Hang on. Can you hear that?
No.
No. Okay. Let me just try and change the settings. Share content. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I've just got to change my speakers. Sorry. I'll just, while I'm doing that, I'll just point out to you some interesting things that I'm going to play Zoom, and you'll see the Zoom auto setup of how it does the transcription, and I'll point out to you how these kind of technological things disadvantage us actually in trying to create a more multilingual world, and make it considerably more difficult, because they only really respond to California English, and that's the only thing that they can manage. And so I quite like it, and it throws up a kind of Zaum in the Russian sense, but it does show the way that we think that the internet is connecting us all more, but in fact it puts up new barriers between us. I'll try that share again.
No, we
No,
can't.
unfortunately. We can't see it or hear it now.
That's very sad. I'll try one more time, and then I will just point the link to you on the Padlet.
Teams is pre-censoring multilingualism.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me I'm a Zoom man, always will be. You know, I think it's okay. One last go. Okay, I'm gonna give up on this, because I think it's just gonna waste everyone's time. So hopefully you can see the Padlet, and you can see the event here. That Tom organized, which was translations of Chekhov into different languages of Scotland, different varieties of Scots and Gaelic. And what I think was interesting, and I urge you all to listen to it, because it's a wonderful event to listen to, even if you don't feel confident in the different varieties of Scots, precisely because of the way that you can feel listening to this language. And when I was listening to Sheena read her Doric version of Rothschild's Fiddle, I thought of Chekhov and the story Peasants, and Olga in the Peasants. And she read the Gospels every day aloud, like someone reading the lesson in church, not understanding much of them, but the holy words moved her to tears, and she almost swooned with delight as she brought out such things as whosoever, or until I bring thee word. So I'm interested in this as this idea of listening to languages and hearing languages, even languages that are very close to us geographically, and perhaps not understanding them, but having a response to them, an affective response. I want to dwell on how translation fits in this question of multilingual paradigms, and talk about one of the kind of classic phrases of translation studies of the last 30 years, which is this idea put forward by Lawrence Venuti, which you can see here in yellow in the bottom right, of a distinction between a domesticating and a foreignizing approach to translation. And you can see that Venuti, who very much prefers a foreignizing method, suggests that domesticating leads to a kind of bringing texts into your culture, flattening them out, and making them part of your, assimilating them to the receiving cultural values, incorporating them into what readers already expect, contrasting this with what he calls a foreignizing method. And we might see the word foreign as perhaps problematic here, which forces us to come to terms with the difference of the text, and it takes us somewhere else. So translation being, again, we have this metaphor that Emily used of being here and being somewhere else at the same time, this kind of spatial dislocation, and this is very much how Venuti sees translation. Now, these terms have been used lots and lots in translation studies, but I'd like to suggest a kind of different way of understanding what Venuti might mean by domestication and perhaps a different opposite to domestication. So I think one way to look at this would be a more of an ecological reading and see the opposite of domestication not being foreignizing, but rather being rewilding, thinking of domestication as an act of taming, of cultivation. Try to use this metaphor to understand how translation can be a practice that promotes a monoculture, that promotes not, you know, a rich, diverse cultural ecosystem, but the equivalent of a massive field of wheat with pesticides, and it's sort of nourishing somehow, but it lacks the diversity that will allow culture to thrive in the future. And I use the term rewilding because it has a particular relevance to a Scottish discourse, and the idea of rewilding is prominent, much more prominent in Scotland than elsewhere in Britain, and it's controversial, but there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. And you can see there, I've put some links up there. Recently, we've had the introduction of beavers. There's a lot of discussion about whether there should be the reintroduction of lynx, etc., into the Scottish ecosystem. So it is quite specific to Scotland. And I think you also see a quite specific translation practice in Scotland because of the pre-existing linguistic diversity within Scotland. So going back to Hugh McDermott and his response, his sort of attempts to create a sort of synthetic Scots in the 1920s that would create a new poetic language in Scotland. But what's interesting to me is how much, when McDermott is doing that, he's doing it in conversation with a European modernism, and particularly, in fact, with Russian modernism, and trying to call on that as a source to kind of generate something new for Scotland. But you can see it as a tradition that then runs through Edwin Morgan and his translations of Mayakovsky into Scots. Both Morgan and McDermott are using a kind of synthetic Scots that they've created, and then Stephen Mulrine, Christine De Luca writing in Shetlandic. Christine was a part of the event with that Tom organized. And then very recently, a translation of a novel which is in Russian and Belarusian by the Belarusian author Alkher Bakharevich into English and Scots, with Scots standing in for Belarusian. So a kind of mapping of the dichotomy between Russian and Belarusian onto English and Scots. I haven't had a chance to read this yet, but I think it's interesting that this continues. It's also very timely. Recently in the news, there's been the announcement of the Booker Prize, again going to a Scottish author, which has reignited slightly discussions about James Kelman's How Late It Was, How Late, which won the Booker in 1994, I think, with its Glaswegian language very evident there on the page. But I think it also ties in with something that, as someone who's moved to Scotland only recently, I can kind of see happening, which is the kind of creation and promotion of a certain Scottish identity as a multilingual and multicultural place. And I think this is summed up very nicely in Jackie Kay's poem, the Scottish Maca, that she read out at the opening of the Scottish Parliament 2 years ago, I think, when she says, "One pater is near enough, mak yourself at home." And she has Polish and Russian and hundreds of other languages in there. But I think this emphasis on the domestic, making yourself at home, has another nice kind of connection with Venuti's term of domestication there, and a different understanding of it. But I'm not really a scholar of Scottish literature, so I'm really interested in what it can do here for Russian literature, and what this process of sort of challenging the monoculture through translation might bring us. So go back to that McDermott idea, where he says that Scots can respond to what European modernism is doing because it is an inchoate Marcel Proust, a Dostoevskian debris of ideas. So McDermott here is giving a classic example of a kind of early 20th century British response to Dostoevsky as this mad, chaotic whirlwind of a figure. And I think there are problems with that reading of Dostoevsky, but it's rather refreshing when you compare it to what Dostoevsky has become in a kind of British-Russian canon now, or indeed what Chekhov has become in a British-Russian canon now. And I think one of the problems, as someone who's spent a long time trying to get people interested in Russian culture, is the hiding in plain sight of so many major Russian figures. There is no shortage of Russian in mainstream British culture, highbrow culture. I mean, Radio 4, you can't turn it on without hearing a kind of dramatization of a Russian novel, etc. But I think we've lost some of the debris of ideas that Russian gave to people in the early 20th century, and that we can use this idea of challenging how Russian comes into the British space and bringing it into a more consciously more diverse British space to help us estrange, going back to Shklovsky, of course, our understanding of what Russia is. I use the term rewilding, however, not completely enthusiastically, or rather I want to draw attention to some of the problems with it. Right. One of them goes to Victoria's point about the urban, and Mirna built on this as well. I think that the idea of rewilding is an urban concept. The wild is an urban, or the concept of civilization, and it is often a patronizing kind of seeking back nostalgia to some version of a romantic past that we project onto the countryside rather than a lived space. And there's a risk of doing that linguistically as well, and overlooking therefore the lived experience of people who actually speak the diverse languages of Scotland. And also I think there's a danger that people have criticized rewilding because it's all about lynxes and wolves, and people don't really talk about different types of bee and ant, etc. And it's these big beasts, these kind of charismatic mammals, that become the focal point of things. And I think that's a danger in translation too, that if we're just doing new versions of Chekhov, it means that we get less of Alan Darker's children and new writing in Russian and Belarusian, etc. I want to conclude by talking about some of the ramifications this might have for area studies and what we're discussing. I was taken by something that Michal said actually in the last seminar that I attended about urban studies, that he actually praised area studies over and above anthropology, and so I thought, okay, yeah, we have come to not to bury area studies but to praise them, and I'll praise them too within the paradigm of modern languages. And there's been a lot of talk. I mean, you can see an official attempt now within modern languages and universities to try and move to a more multilingual paradigm. The University Council for Modern Languages has just circulated a Recreating Modern Languages toolkit, which calls for staff and students to transgress a national and monolingual focus, a recognition of multilingualism in the curriculum, embedding ecological and ethnographic research across different languages and cultures. And I think area studies has something of an advantage in this, and it has always, to a certain extent, had a transnational approach, with limits and problems within that. And so in fact, people who teach Russian and Polish have ended up in the past 2 decades in modern languages departments, having often been in area studies departments before. But I think we can bring some of our training and our sort of background to bear on this shift in modern languages more broadly. But I do think there are limits and problems with this. And going back again to something that was said last week about the idea of us being in a center looking out, that I think this rewilding that translation can bring us is a way of challenging this kind of implicit division between us in the stable center known as Britain and looking out at the area, broadly speaking, a kind of Eastern Europe, post-Soviet, post-Warsaw Pact, post-everything kind of way. And I think what's interesting about, I mean, talking very schematically about that, is that there has been in the field a recognition of the diversity of that area, but it tends towards this, what I would call the 10 maps that explain Ukraine sort of way of explaining things, suggesting that you can understand the complexity of the region, but it's a complexity that is mapped exactly geographically, and that you just have tiny little chunks, and that identity in Ukraine can be solved by linguistics or by saying who speaks what language or something like that. But of course, as we know, language is much more complicated than that. And perhaps by centering some kind of awareness of the linguistic diversity of the world in which we exist in Scotland, that can help us have a more sophisticated understanding of the cultural realities on the ground, so to speak, in the field. And that includes understanding, as Mirna and Elwira spoke, the fact that the area, Eastern Europe, is already here. It's already with us in Glasgow, on the streets of Glasgow and St Andrews. So I'll finish there. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I do urge you all to listen to Sheena's reading. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jamie, so much. I think we should, firstly, I want to just thank everybody, because some people are going to have to go and teach, but I'd really like to consider this as a starting point for discussion, maybe something that we want to reprise at some point. So could we start by having any questions for Elwira and Mirna from the audience, just to check whether there are any? You can either break in by putting on the microphone, type something in the box, or you could put your hand up, I think. Is there anything specific that people would like to ask Mirna and Elwira? Otherwise, I will look. I'll just open it up. Aha. No, that's not what I thought it is. That team silence that we're also used to now. Perhaps the panel members could turn on their cameras. That would be great if for those who are here. Thank you. So there's really so much material that has been covered here. I have lots of questions. One certainly area that I think people have talked about is affect. I think that's really interesting. And in the comments in the meeting chat, there have been a lot of there's been a discussion about urban the urban-rural paradigm. Mirna, do you have anything you want to just share before you have to run?
If there were some interesting ideas about urban rural, and I could really talk about it for hours, in the context of the Balkans, especially, not so much in Central Europe. So if anybody wants to contact us, please do. We can share our emails, and Emily also have contact on us. I would just like to go back to Jamie's reflection about this emotional aspect of the language. I think we can say it now, during this pandemic, that, for instance, the use of lockdown, how I relate this to the urban space. I mean, the term lockdown is so actually emotional. And then when we think about it across languages, people will always link it to previous experiences that they have. For instance, I know many of my Bosnian friends who survived the siege of Sarajevo will definitely think about the lockdown in terms of them being in the shelter in their basements, for 3 or 4 years. And, and from that, they're going to develop a story, a narrative about this experience. So, I think this is, how emotions are processed. This is how, words find their ways into different contexts. I think it is also, vice versa, not just, the English going elsewhere, but, all of these foreign concepts, the so-called foreign coming to us. But this is, exactly what I meant by, shared experiences. So we take only one word and then we think, what kinds of meanings it has for us based on our own life experiences, histories of our regions, our cultures, our traditions, and our memories as well. So hopefully, Jamie, this answered your question at least partially, but, of course, we can discuss this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Put me down for the workshops, I say.
Okay, no problem. Yep, thank you. So yeah, I think we have to go now. Emily, thank you so much for inviting us, and we hope to see all of you very soon. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. And Jamie, fantastic contribution. A lot of food for thought. Thank you.
Emily, we can't hear you.
I had to do that at some point. I just was saying thank you for participating in the middle of teaching. There's a mismatch, I think, between the semesters here. Any questions quickly? I think we could go on for an extra 5 minutes at this point.
I had a question for Polina, if I can ask one. I was interested in what you were saying about, this was Russian as the person you were talking to was using it, and and I was just wondering, I mean, in my impression, often there's like a very within particularly pedagogic kind of cultures in Russian, a very normative approach to the Russian language, right? And like you can, you know, right and wrongness in Russian is kind of enshrined, and it's something people talk about a lot more than I think they talk about even in English. And I was wondering whether that was something that you perceive, and also that your migrants felt as well, that there was this kind of real cultural capital in the correct use of Russian, particularly Russian amongst all languages.
Yes, thank you so much, Jamie. I would agree that there is a particular discourse about teaching the right variant of Russian, which is shared in school context and the university context. But what I was particularly surprised is that it kind of also transferred to this very grassroots initiatives that dealt with migrants in these local small community-based projects. So they would also start by discussing Tolstoy or something like reciting Tuchev to school kids, rather than letting them have some speaking practice, or introducing some vocabulary to, I don't know, approach a doctor or something like that. So it is interesting how this, in a way, it kind of it did bring a bit of a parallel with what I was doing in my earlier project with Russian speakers in the UK. How there was this clear distinction between the Russian 1 and Russian 2. One of them is that great and mighty one, which is not for the communication but more for this symbolical worshipping, whereas the other one is more flexible, fluctuant, and that's the one that they actually use. And there again, there is this clear distinction that is any educational effort is about the first one rather than the second one, and that is something that is, I found quite interesting.
Daria, please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to that. It's not so much a question, but also reflecting as a Ukrainian who taught Russian here in St. Andrews as well. And I'm a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. I mean, I speak Ukrainian as well, but my family is Russian-speaking. But it's quite interesting in a way how I censor myself all the time, also speaking Russian. It's particularly high censorship when I speak to Russian speakers from Russia, because in Ukraine it's quite acceptable now to kind of integrate Ukrainian words into your speaking. But I feel quite a lot of stress quite often teaching, and afraid to just make some mistakes, which in Ukraine you wouldn't even notice because it's such part of everyday reality. And also how I would censor because I come from the south of Ukraine, so within my family I would use the softer h sometimes, but very soft, and I would censor it even with Russian speakers in Ukraine who are not probably just my family. But also talking about rewilding, I think Ukraine has a lot of this going on now with Surzik, which is a mixture of Russian, Ukrainian, appearing more and more on TV, quite common. Also, on all kind of TV shows, but also in songs, the bands that perform in Surzik becoming very. And at the moment, I'm working on an animation film, which is only 11 minutes, but it's really a lot of pain in terms of language because the screenplay I wrote in Ukrainian, kind of literatury ukrainski язык, and now basically what we do is bastardizing it and introducing Surzik and introducing kind of less literary aspect of the language, which is a very stressful task because you don't want to caricature people the way they speak, but at the same time you kind of want to reflect the realities of languages within Ukraine. So it kind of makes me think of rewilding the script at the moment as well in many ways. But yeah, so it's a lot of things really resonated with me listening to you, but I don't really have a question.
I think that's really great. We do have one more question which I might have a go at, and then I think we'll have to finish, from Shorki Bukhari, who asks how we can help an immigrant language with low prestige and what could be step one. I'm becoming interested in the mismatch between representations of what happens in schools, in literature, particularly young adult fiction, and the new research that's going on to do with translanguaging and allowing students to access all the languages that they have. So I think that's a really interesting question. I think that we also have a really strange situation where effectively, say in Scotland, we have all sorts of kids in school whose Polish is being suppressed, devalued, and then we're saying, oh, but we want to have these departments at universities, and we want students to apply to come and learn not Polish at St Andrews, but say Russian or something like this, and that's such a that doesn't fit together as far as I'm concerned. Jamie, why don't you continue?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing on that, which relates to that prestige question, and I think it's a thing that people talk about in multilingualism a lot, is challenging this idea of the native speaker. And I think for me that's one of the most important things about listening to Doric and not understanding Doric. And this has become, for me, as like a very standard English speaker, has become more part of my experience living in Scotland, of like not always exactly understanding what people say. And that's an important thing, because it's important for everyone to learn that they have not perfected what they consider their own language, right? And that it's a sad state of affairs when we contrast native speaker as being in some kind of complete place to learner, be they immigrant or student, as being in some place of lack, because it's really everyone is on a journey to greater understanding. So I think we can try and help like immigrants, learners, everyone, by trying to challenge this idea that just by being born in a place, you suddenly have 100% knowledge and complete mastery of its linguistic environment, which isn't the case.
Yeah, I think we need to end there. I'm really sorry about that, but I think we need to continue. There will be a recording of this, so maybe we can pick up where we left off. But I think there have been lots of provoking thoughts about how maybe area studies can, overcome some of its own deficiencies or prejudices, but also some of the structural things in place that actually work against multilingualism. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.